Welcome back. Welcome to the Premier Mindset by Premier Performance LLC. I'm your host, Trent Mailer, LCSW, licensed clinical therapist and performance coach, and this is episode 74. Every season, it happens. A team loaded with talent falls apart. The preseason rankings were high. The expectations were championship level. The roster was filled with athletes that looked incredible in practice. Coaches believed they finally had the pieces. Fans believed this was the year. Yet somewhere between opening day and the middle of the season, something changed, and almost nobody could explain why. Most people point to the wrong moment. They point to the losing streak. They point to the missed assignment. They point to the turnover. They point to the bad game. But the scoreboard is almost never where collapse begins. It's simply where collapse becomes visible. The real breakdown starts weeks earlier. Inside conversations nobody is paying attention to. It starts inside body language, inside trust, inside accountability, inside the subtle psychological shifts that slowly change how people show up for one another. That's what we're talking about today. Because if you're a coach, an athlete, a leader, or anyone responsible for building high-performing teams, this conversation has very little to do with football, basketball, baseball, or business. It has everything to do with human behavior under pressure. And if you understand that, you'll start recognizing collapse before anyone else even realizes it's happening. Quick note before we dive in. This podcast is for education and performance growth. It's not a replacement for therapy or medical treatment. If there's something you need, make sure you go and get it. With that, all of our social media accounts and the newsletter are all linked in the episode description below. So make sure to get involved there, follow along as we continue to build up these communities and continue to put out more content. Now getting back into it. Picture this. It's halftime. Your team is only down by 3. Objectively, you're in a great position. The game is right there. There's no reason to panic. The adjustments are manageable. The talent is still in the room. But something feels different. 3 weeks ago, players were talking constantly. Veterans were encouraging younger teammates. Coaches barely had to create energy because the locker room created it on its own. Today, nobody is yelling. Nobody is arguing. Nobody is encouraging anyone either. Players stare at the floor. A few quietly check their phones. One captain says almost nothing. Another player sits alone with his headphones on. Everyone is waiting for someone else to speak. The scoreboard says you're down by 3. The locker room says you're down by much more than that. And that's the moment most coaches miss, because they immediately begin thinking strategically. What adjustment do we need? What coverage should we run? Should we change personnel? Those questions matter, but they're not the first question. The first question should be, what happened to this room? Because strategy doesn't disappear overnight. Culture does. Talent doesn't vanish in a month. Trust can. This is one of the biggest misconceptions in performance psychology. People assume great teams collapse because they stop executing. More often, they stop trusting. Execution is usually the symptom. Trust is usually the disease. I've worked with enough athletes and high performers to notice the same pattern over and over again. The collapse almost never feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels subtle. One player stops speaking up. One leader gets frustrated and becomes quieter. A difficult conversation gets postponed because nobody wants conflict. Someone shows up late. Nobody addresses it. A sarcastic comment gets laughed off. The standard slips just a little. Nothing seems significant enough to worry about until months later. Everyone wonders how such a talented group underachieved. The answer isn't hidden inside one big event. It's buried underneath hundreds of small moments that nobody believed mattered. Culture rarely collapses all at once. It erodes one compromise at a time. One of the biggest mistakes coaches make is measuring only visible performance. They measure wins, losses, statistics, film grades, conditioning numbers, and those metrics matter, but they're lagging indicators. By the time those numbers change, the psychological environment has often been changing for weeks. Elite leaders learn to measure something different. They measure the health of the room. When I evaluate a team, I'm paying attention to questions most people never asked. Who stopped talking? Who used to lead but suddenly disappeared? What conversations aren't happening anymore? Are teammates correcting one another? Or are they avoiding accountability because it's uncomfortable? When mistakes happen, does the room move closer together or further apart? Those answers tell me far more about where a season is headed than last week's score ever will. One of the simplest exercises I use is what I call the locker room pulse check. It's intentionally uncomplicated because complicated systems rarely get used consistently. Instead of asking whether the team is performing well, ask whether the environment is performing well. Has communication improved or become quieter? Does the room feel connected or fragmented? Are players taking ownership or protecting themselves? Has energy become contagious in a positive direction, or has negativity quietly become the loudest voice in the building? Those answers reveal problems long before the standings do, because teams don't suddenly wake up disconnected. Disconnection accumulates. Here's another pattern that deserves far more attention. Standards almost never disappear overnight. They drift. Nobody decides they're going to stop being disciplined. Instead, discipline slowly becomes negotiable. The first missed sprint gets ignored. The first film session where people aren't fully engaged gets overlooked. The first teammate who doesn't hold someone accountable decides it's not worth saying anything. Small compromises feel harmless because they're small. But culture doesn't measure moments individually. Culture measures patterns. That's why I encourage leaders to regularly perform what I call a standards drift audit. Don't wait until major problems appear. Look for the tiny standards that have quietly changed. Ask yourself what behavior would have been unacceptable 6 weeks ago that now barely gets noticed. That question alone has prevented more team collapses than many motivational speeches ever could. Because the biggest threats to elite performance rarely announce themselves. They whisper. They ask for one exception, one shortcut, one ignored conversation, one lowered expectation, then another and another, until eventually nobody remembers where excellence started slipping away. Here's something else that's important to understand. Culture isn't built during easy seasons. It's revealed during difficult ones. Every locker room feels united after a big win. Every organization talks about family when business is booming. Every leader looks confident when everything is working. Pressure exposes whether trust actually exists. It doesn't create culture. It reveals it. That's why talented teams often surprise everyone when they fall apart. People assume the losses created division. In reality, the division was already there. The losses simply removed the illusion that everything was fine. And that's an uncomfortable truth. But it's also an incredibly empowering one. Because if psychological drift starts before performance declines, then leaders have far more influence than they think. You don't have to wait until the season is slipping away. You don't have to wait until people quit believing. You don't have to wait until blame replaces accountability. You can recognize the warning signs while they're still small enough to change. And that's exactly where elite leadership separates itself from average leadership. Average leaders react to problems. Elite leaders recognize patterns before they become problems. They notice changes in communication. They notice changes in emotional energy. They notice changes in ownership because they understand something that too many people learn too late. The reason talented teams collapse isn't because they suddenly lose talent. It's because they slowly lose trust. Talent wins games. Trust sustains seasons. And once people stop trusting each other, every mistake becomes bigger than the mistake itself. By now, I want you thinking about your own environment. Whether you're coaching a football team, leading a company, running a business, or competing yourself. And don't immediately ask whether performance is declining. Ask something far more important. Has trust become quieter? Have standards become negotiable? Have conversations become less honest? Has ownership quietly been replaced by blame? Because if the answer to those questions is yes, you may not have a performance problem. You may have a psychological one. And understanding that distinction might be what saves your season before the scoreboard ever tells you it's in danger. The most dangerous moment for a team is not always when conflict appears. Conflict is normal. Every great team has disagreements. Every championship team has moments where people challenge each other, question decisions, and have difficult conversations. The difference between healthy teams and collapsing teams is not whether conflict exists. The difference is whether people feel safe enough, committed enough, and mature enough to work through it. Collapse does not usually happen because teammates disagree. Collapse happens because teammates stop believing disagreement can be handled productively. That is where talented teams begin to separate from elite teams. Average teams avoid tension because they believe harmony means everyone is getting along. Elite teams understand that trust is not built by avoiding uncomfortable conversations. Trust is built by knowing that difficult conversations can happen without destroying the relationship. When a locker room becomes afraid of honesty, people start protecting themselves instead of protecting the team. They stop asking, what does this group need from me? And start asking, how do I make sure I'm not the one blamed? That shift changes everything. Because once players move into self-protection mode, the team begins to fracture internally. The jersey may still be the same. The goals may still be the same. Everyone may still say the right things during interviews. But underneath the surface, the psychological connection starts weakening. People become less willing to take risks, less willing to admit mistakes, less willing to challenge teammates, less willing to hold standards because they no longer trust how those conversations will be received. And this is where identity becomes a major factor. High performers are often incredibly invested in their role. That investment is part of what makes them successful. The quarterback who studies extra film, the captain who shows up early, the entrepreneur who works when nobody is watching, the executive who carries the weight of an organization. Commitment is not the problem. The problem begins when someone's entire identity becomes dependent on maintaining that role. Because when identity and performance become fused together, feedback stops feeling like information and it starts feeling like a threat. Imagine a Monday morning film session after 2 difficult losses. The team is frustrated, but nobody has directly addressed what is happening. Coaches know the energy feels different. Players know the energy feels different. Everyone can feel the tension, but nobody has named it. The film starts. A defensive player misses an assignment that leads to a major mistake. The coach stops the film and addresses it directly. The feedback is not personal. It is about execution. It is about responsibility. It is about getting better. But the player immediately becomes defensive. He explains why it happened. He points out another mistake. He talks about the coverage. He talks about the communication. The room gets quieter, not because nobody has an opinion, because everybody is watching what happens next. The coach continues. The player shuts down. And then something subtle happens that most people miss. Several teammates look away. Nobody speaks up. Nobody says, hey, we've all been there. Let's fix it. Nobody says, that's on us too. We need to communicate better. Nobody asks a question. The moment passes. But psychologically, something much bigger happened. The room just learned something. The room learned that vulnerability might not be safe. The next player who makes a mistake remembers that moment. The next player who has a concern remembers that moment. The next player who wants to challenge a teammate remembers that moment. And eventually, everyone makes the same decision. I'm going to keep my mouth shut. That decision spreads faster than any motivational speech because emotional contagion is one of the most powerful forces inside a team environment. We often talk about energy being contagious when we mean enthusiasm. We talk about the player who brings intensity. We talk about the leader who raises everyone's standards. But emotions work in every direction. Confidence spreads. So does fear. Ownership spreads. So does avoidance. Courage spreads. So does silence. A locker room does not become disconnected because everyone wakes up one day and decides they no longer care. It becomes disconnected because enough people experience moments where protecting themselves feels safer than contributing honestly. That is why coaches and leaders have to understand the difference between compliance and commitment. A compliant team does what it is told. A committed team takes ownership. A compliant player follows standards because someone is watching. A committed player protects standards because they understand what the standards represent. When trust begins to disappear, teams often become filled with compliant people. They show up, they practice, they attend meetings, they say the right things, but they stop investing emotionally. And that is what happens when talented teams become dangerous. Because talent without connection creates fragile performance. Everything works when things are going well, but adversity reveals whether the foundation is actually strong. A team with trust can handle mistakes because mistakes are viewed as opportunities to adjust. A team without trust turns mistakes into evidence. Evidence that someone is unreliable. Evidence that someone is selfish. Evidence that someone is not good enough. And once teammates begin collecting evidence against each other, the team stops functioning as one unit. This is why identity becomes so important. One exercise I encourage athletes and teams to explore is what I call the identity over role exercise. The purpose is simple. Your position is your role. It is not your identity. A player may be a quarterback, a captain, a starter, a leader, or the person everyone looks to in difficult moments. Those things matter. They should take pride in those responsibilities. But they cannot become the only source of value someone has. Because when someone believes their worth depends entirely on their role, they start protecting the role instead of serving the team. A starter becomes afraid to admit weakness because they think honesty will cost them playing time. A veteran becomes resistant to younger players challenging them because they believe respect means control. A leader avoids accountability because they believe mistakes will damage their reputation. The irony is that the very behaviors they use to protect their identity are the behaviors that damage the culture around them. The strongest leaders are not the people who never struggle. They're the people who are secure enough to be honest when they do. That is a completely different level of leadership. A person who needs to appear perfect will eventually create distance. A person who is comfortable being accountable creates trust. This is why psychological safety matters so much inside high-performance environments. Psychological safety does not mean lowering standards. It does not mean everyone gets a trophy. It does not mean avoiding hard conversations. That is all a misunderstanding. Psychological safety means people can tell the truth without fearing that honesty will destroy their belonging. The highest performing teams are not comfortable because nobody challenges each other. They are comfortable because everyone knows challenge comes from a place of commitment. That distinction changes everything. A coach who says, "You made a mistake and we need to fix it because we believe you can do better," creates a completely different environment than a coach who communicates, "You made a mistake and now you need to prove you deserve to be here." The words may sound similar. The psychological impact is completely different. That is where leaders have become intentional. When trust begins to decline, the first response cannot always be correction. Sometimes the first response needs to be curiosity. Instead of immediately asking, why isn't this player buying in? Ask what changed. Instead of asking, why are people not communicating? Ask what made communication feel unsafe. Instead of asking, why is this team becoming selfish? Ask, where did people start feeling like they had to protect themselves? Those questions lead you toward the actual problem, because behavior is usually communication. A player who becomes quiet may not be lazy. They may be just disconnected. A player who becomes defensive may not lack accountability. They may feel threatened. A player who stops leading may not have lost passion. They may have stopped believing their own voice matters. This is why elite leaders do not just observe actions. They interpret them. They look underneath the behavior to understand the psychology driving it. One of the most effective ways to begin rebuilding that environment is through what I call the trust temperature conversations. These are not complicated meetings. They're not long emotional sessions. They are intentional moments where leaders create space for honesty before problems become resentment. The questions are simple. What isn't being said? What tension needs to be addressed? What conversation are we avoiding because it feels uncomfortable? Those questions are powerful because most teams do not fail because nobody knows there is a problem. They fail because everyone knows there is a problem and nobody believes they can safely address it. The silence becomes the culture, and silence has a cost. Because every avoided conversation creates a little more distance. Every unresolved frustration creates a little more separation. Every moment where someone chooses protection over connection weakens the foundation. Most locker rooms do not explode. They slowly go quiet. People stop challenging each other, stop holding standards, stop having hard conversations. Eventually, everyone is wearing the same jersey, but nobody is fighting for the same mission. That is the moment leaders have to recognize, because the greatest threat to talented teams is not adversity. Every team faces adversity. Every team loses games. Every team experiences setbacks. The greatest threat is isolation. When players start feeling like they're individually surviving instead of collectively building something, the culture begins to disappear. And once a team loses that connection, talent becomes much harder to access. Because performance is not only about what individuals are capable of doing, it's about whether the environment allows those capabilities to come together. A championship culture is not created by having the best athletes in the room. It is created when the people in the room trust each other enough to bring their best. And that is the difference between a talented team and a truly elite team. A talented team has ability. An elite team has alignment. A talented team can win when everything goes right. An elite team can stay connected when everything goes wrong. The question every coach, leader, and athlete has to ask is not simply, do we have enough talent? The better question is, have we created an environment where our talent can actually function together? Because if the answer is no, the problem is no longer about skill. It is about psychology. And fixing that requires more than motivation. It requires understanding the systems that rebuild trust, restore accountability, and bring people back together before the season is lost. At this point, the question changes. It is no longer about just recognizing that the locker room is struggling. Awareness matters, but awareness without action does not change anything. A coach can identify that trust is declining. A leader can recognize that communication has become weaker. An athlete can feel the energy inside the team has shifted. But the teams that recover are not the ones that simply identify the problem. They're the ones that understand how to rebuild the environment one interaction at a time. Because culture is not repaired through one speech. It is not repaired by bringing everyone together after a loss and telling them that they need to care more. And it is not repaired by putting up another motivational quote in the locker room. Those moments can create emotion, But emotion without behavior change fades quickly. Culture is rebuilt through repeated behaviors. It is rebuilt through the small decisions people make every single day about how they communicate, how they respond to adversity, how they handle mistakes, and how they treat the people beside them. That is where many leaders make a critical mistake. They assume the problem is motivation. They assume players are not trying hard enough. They assume the team needs more intensity. But sometimes the issue is not that people do not care. Sometimes the issue is that people care so much that they have become afraid. Afraid to make mistakes, afraid to be honest, afraid to challenge someone, afraid to admit something is wrong. And fear changes behavior because a player who is afraid protects himself, while a player who feels trusted invests himself. Those are completely different psychological states. This is why rebuilding a locker room requires leaders to understand what is happening beneath the surface. Human beings do not perform in isolation. We are constantly responding to the environment around us. We are reading body language. We are interpreting tone. We are sensing whether the people around us are safe, supportive, and committed to the same mission. A team is a psychological system. Every person affects the system. Every conversation affects the system. Every reaction to pressure affects the system. And when leaders understand that, they stop looking at culture as something that simply exists, and they start treating culture as something that must be intentionally built. One of the first things leaders have to restore is emotional regulation, because teams under pressure often do not have a talent problem. They have a regulation problem. When pressure increases, people become more reactive. The nervous system moves into protection mode. Athletes become focused on avoiding mistakes instead of creating solutions. Leaders become more controlling instead of more connected. Coaches become frustrated because they feel like they are losing influence. The problem is that dysregulated environments create more dysregulation. A frustrated coach creates anxious players. Anxious players create hesitant decisions. Hesitant decisions create more mistakes. More mistakes create more frustration. And suddenly the entire team is trapped in a cycle that has very little to do with actual ability. Elite leaders interrupt that cycle. They understand that their emotional state is contagious. The way they enter a room matters. The way they respond to mistakes matters. Because people do not just listen to what leaders say. They study what leaders do. This is where behavioral modeling becomes so important. A coach can talk about accountability every day. But if the coach avoids difficult conversations, the team learns avoidance. A captain can talk about toughness. But if the captain disappears when things get difficult, a team learns that toughness is conditional. A leader can talk about ownership. But if that leader blames everyone else when something goes wrong, the team learns that ownership only applies when it's convenient. Culture is not built by the standards you announce. Culture is built by the behaviors you consistently demonstrate. That is why one of the most important questions any leader can ask is what I call the leadership mirror exercise. The question is simple. What behavior am I modeling every day? Not what behavior am I asking for? Not what behavior do I wish my team had? What behavior am I actually demonstrating? Because teams copy behavior more than they follow instructions. If you want a team that communicates, you have to communicate. If you want a team that takes accountability, you have to take accountability. If you want a team that stays composed under pressure, you have to become someone who can regulate yourself under pressure. The environment always reflects the people responsible for creating it. And that responsibility is uncomfortable because it means leaders cannot only look outward, they have to look inward. They have to be willing to ask, where am I contributing to the problem? That question separates true leadership from authority. Authority looks for someone to blame. Leadership looks for where it can create change. One of the biggest shifts that can transform a struggling locker room is moving from opinion before ownership to ownership before opinion. Because one of the fastest ways to destroy trust is when everyone has an opinion and nobody has ownership. Everybody knows what the problem is. Everyone knows who needs to improve. Everyone knows what someone else should be doing. But very few people stop and ask the more difficult question: what have I contributed to this? That question changes the entire dynamic, because accountability without ownership feels like criticism. Accountability with ownership becomes growth. A teammate saying, "you need to communicate better," lands differently than a teammate saying, "I also could have communicated better there. We both need to fix this." The second statement creates partnership. The first creates separation. Elite teams do not avoid accountability. They make accountability something people experience as commitment instead of punishment. That distinction is everything, because the goal is not to create a locker room where nobody makes mistakes. That environment does not exist. The goal is to create a locker room where mistakes can be addressed without people becoming defensive, disconnected, or afraid. This is where the 24-hour repair rule becomes so powerful. Most team problems do not become major because the original issue was impossible to solve. They become major because the issue is allowed to sit. Unspoken frustration creates stories. Stories create assumptions. Assumptions creates distance. Distance creates resentment. And resentment eventually changes the behavior. The 24-hour repair rule is simple. When conflict happens, address it within one day. Not because every conversation has to be perfect, not because emotions are never present, but because unresolved tension compounds. A teammate says something that bothers you. You do not address it. You carry it into practice. Now your communication changes. They notice your communication changes. They create their own explanation. Now both people are responding to assumptions instead of reality. A 5-minute conversation could have prevented weeks of unnecessary separation. High-performing teams are not built by people who never experience tension. They are built by people who know how to repair tension quickly. That is the difference. Conflict is inevitable. Disconnection is optional. I've seen this pattern repeatedly when working with athletes and high performers. One of the things that has stood out to me is that many teams do not have an effort problem. They do not have a talent problem. They do not have a commitment problem. They have a communication problem that eventually becomes mistaken for a motivation problem. The players still care. The coaches still care. Everyone wants the same outcome. But somewhere along the way, people stopped having the conversations necessary to move forward together. And once those conversations finally happen, something interesting often occurs. Performance improves faster than expected. Not because someone learned a new skill overnight, not because the team suddenly became more talented, but because the psychological weight was lifted. People were no longer spending energy protecting themselves. They could redirect that energy towards performing. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings about culture. People think culture work is separate from performance. It's not. Culture is the environment that determines whether performance can consistently exist. A team with poor trust has to spend energy managing internal problems. A team with strong trust can spend energy solving external problems. That difference matters, because championship level performance requires more than individual excellence. It requires collective efficacy. Collective efficacy is the belief that together, this group can handle what comes next. It's not blind confidence. It's not pretending everything is easy. It is earned belief. It comes from experiencing adversity together and learning we can solve problems, we can have hard conversations, we can hold each other accountable, we can get better. That belief changes how teams respond when pressure arrives. A fragile team sees adversity as evidence that something is wrong. A connected team sees adversity as something they are capable of navigating. The difference is not talent. The difference is trust. And trust built through action. One of the most important actions leaders can take during a rebuild is practicing what I call connection before correction. This does not mean avoiding correction. High-performing teams require correction. Standards matter. Feedback matters. But correction without connection often feels like rejection. Before people can fully receive feedback, they need to understand the relationship behind it. They need to know this person is challenging me because they believe in me, not this person is looking for a reason to criticize me. The best coaches and leaders understand that people grow faster when they feel valued. Relationship first, coaching second. Connection creates the foundation where accountability can actually work. Because when people trust the person delivering the message, they're more willing to hear the message. They're more willing to adjust. They're more willing to take responsibility. And that is how teams begin rebuilding. Not through a single dramatic moment, through hundreds of small moments where people choose trust over protection, where they choose ownership over blame, where they choose honesty over comfort. The healthiest locker rooms are not the ones with the fewest problems. Every team has problems. The healthiest locker rooms are the ones that solve problems faster. They do not allow tension to become distance. They do not allow mistakes to become identity. They do not allow difficult moments to become permanent divisions. They understand that the goal is not perfection. The goal is repair. Because elite teams do not eliminate conflict. They eliminate unresolved conflict. And that is what allows talented people to stay connected long enough to become something greater than individual talent alone. A group of talented individuals can win games, but a connected team can build something that lasts. And that is the foundation leaders have to create before moving into the final level of cultural building. Because the ultimate question is not just whether a team can recover from adversity. The ultimate question is whether the environment is strong enough to help people become better together. That is where leadership becomes bigger than wins and losses. That is where culture becomes bigger than a season. That is where a team begins creating a legacy. At this point, the conversation becomes bigger than a locker room. Because the truth is, building a championship culture is not only about winning games. It is not only about preparing for a season. It is not only about creating a team that performs when everything is going well. The real test of leadership is whether you can create an environment that survives pressure, adversity, disappointment, and uncertainty. Anyone can lead when the scoreboard is in their favor. Anyone can talk about culture when the team is winning. The true measure of leadership is what happens when things get difficult and people have every reason to separate. That is when culture reveals itself. Because championships are not built only through talent. They are built through relationships. They're built through trust. They're built through the thousands of small decisions people make when nobody is watching. The conversation after a difficult practice. The teammate who chooses honesty instead of avoidance. The leader who takes responsibility instead of searching for someone to blame. Those moments rarely make headlines, but those moments are where elite environments are created. Most people think culture is something you establish at the beginning of a season. They think it is the team motto on the wall, the slogan on the shirts, the speech before the first game. Those things can create awareness, but culture is not created by what a team says it believes. Culture is created by what a team repeatedly does. And that is why leadership is such a responsibility. Because every leader is creating an environment, whether they realize it or not. Every coach, every captain, every executive, every entrepreneur, every person who influences a group of people. You're always teaching something. Your reactions teach something. Your standards teach something. Your silence teaches something. The question is not whether you are influencing the culture, because you are. The question is whether you are influencing it intentionally. Because the strongest teams are not built by people who simply hope everyone stays connected. They are built by people who continuously protect connection. That is a completely different mindset. It requires leaders to stop viewing culture as a destination and to start viewing it as a system that needs maintenance. Just like physical conditioning, just like skill development, just like game preparation. Culture requires repetition. It requires attention. It requires honest evaluation. One of the biggest mistakes organizations make is that they only evaluate performance. They look at the scoreboard, they look at numbers, they look at outcomes. But elite organizations evaluate the environment producing those outcomes. Because results are often delayed reflections of culture. A team can win while having unhealthy dynamics. A company can grow while leadership problems are forming underneath the surface. A group can achieve success while quietly losing the connection that created the success in the first place. That is why leaders need a process for checking the health of the environment before the environment breaks. One of the most effective ways to do this is through what I call a weekly cultural review. The purpose is simple. Before asking, how did we perform? Ask, how did we function together? Did communication improve? Did people feel comfortable being honest? Did teammates challenge each other in productive ways? Did leaders create clarity and trust? Did people feel like they were contributing to something bigger than themselves? Those questions matter because performance is always connected to the environment around it. A talented individual can overcome a lot. A talented team can accomplish even more. But a talented team without alignment will eventually hit a ceiling because talent creates opportunity. Alignment creates sustainability. And that difference is what separates teams that have moments of success from teams that consistently operate at a high level. This is where purpose becomes critical because people cannot stay committed to something they do not feel connected to. A team cannot just exist to win. Winning matters. But if winning is the only thing holding the group together, the culture becomes fragile. Because eventually everyone experiences adversity. Every team loses. Every athlete struggles. Every organization faces uncertainty. The question becomes, what remains when the outcome is not guaranteed? That is why elite teams operate from what I call the purpose before performance framework. Performance is the outcome. It is not the identity. A championship is the result of the culture. It cannot be the only reason the culture exists. When people are connected to purpose, they're willing to endure difficulty because they understand what they are building. They're not just working for a scoreboard. They're working for something bigger. They're building trust. They're building character. They're becoming the type of people who can handle pressure together. And that is where true leadership begins. Because leadership is not about having the loudest voice in the room. It's not about being the person everyone notices. It is not about controlling every decision. Leadership is about creating conditions where other people can become their best. The best leaders do not make people dependent on them. They make people stronger because of them. They create confidence. They create clarity. They create accountability. They create belonging. And belonging is one of the most powerful forces inside any high-performing environment because people perform differently when they believe they matter. They communicate differently when they believe their voice matters. They handle adversity differently when they believe they are not facing it alone. A team that feels connected does not avoid challenges. They face them together. That is why leaders have to consistently ask difficult questions, not just when things are going wrong, especially when things appear to be going well. One of the most important questions leaders can ask themselves and each other is this: what are we pretending isn't a problem? Because every organization has something. Every locker room has something. Every team has a conversation that would create growth if someone was willing to start it. The dangerous environments are not the ones with problems. Every environment has problems. The dangerous environments are the ones where people stop believing problems can be solved. That is when silence becomes stronger than accountability. That is when comfort becomes more important than growth. That is when talented groups begin slowly becoming disconnected. Leadership ownership meetings create space for those conversations. They create a place where leaders stop protecting appearances and start protecting the mission. Where the question is not who is responsible for this problem. The question is, what do we need to do to solve this together? That shift changes everything because ownership creates movement. Blame creates distance. And the difference between those two determines whether a team grows through adversity or fractures because of it. Years from now, very few people will remember your record. Even fewer will remember the statistics. They may remember the championship. They may remember the wins. But every person will remember how that environment felt. They will remember whether they felt valued, whether they felt trusted, whether they felt challenged, whether they felt like they were becoming better because they were part of that team, or whether they slowly started disconnecting from the people around them. Because the greatest tragedy in performance is not losing. Failure is part of the competition. The greatest tragedy is watching extraordinary people become ordinary because nobody protected the environment that allowed them to become extraordinary together. Think about that. A group can have all the talent in the world. They can have the physical ability, they can have the resources, they can have the opportunities. But the environment does not allow people to trust, communicate, and challenge each other. That talent never reaches its potential. Talent gives you possibility. Psychology determines whether you ever reach it. That is why culture cannot be left to chance. The highest performing teams build it intentionally. They protect it relentlessly. They strengthen it continuously. They understand that every interaction either strengthens the foundation or weakens it. Every conversation matters. Every standard matters. Every response to adversity matters. Because eventually those moments become the identity of the team. And identity determines behavior. A team that believes we protect each other behaves differently than a team that believes everyone is on their own. A team that believes we solve problems together behaves differently than a team that believes someone else needs to fix this. A team that believes our success depends on all of us behaves differently than a team that believes I just need to protect my own position. That is why the best leaders are not obsessed only with results. They're obsessed with the environment creating those results because they understand something most people learn too late. Championships are not built on game day. They're built months before. They're built in conversations nobody sees. They're built in the standards nobody celebrates. They're built in the moments when choosing the team over yourself is inconvenient. That is where leadership lives. That is where the culture is created. If you are a coach, an athlete, an executive, or someone responsible for leading others, the question is not simply whether your people have enough talent. The question is whether you have created an environment where that talent can actually thrive. Because education alone is not enough. Knowing what creates a great culture is different from actually building one. Understanding leadership principles is different from applying them when pressure arrives. The highest performers do not just collect information. They seek accountability. They seek feedback. They seek environments that challenge them to become better. That is the work we do through Premier Performance, helping athletes, coaches, leaders, and organizations understand the psychology behind performance, develop strong leadership systems, improving team dynamics, and creating environments where people consistently perform at their highest levels. Because the goal is not simply to help people win more. The goal is to help people become the type of leaders and competitors who can sustain success. The teams that last are not always the most talented. They're the ones that refuse to let trust erode one conversation at a time. Because championships are built long before they're won. They're built in every conversation, every standard, every difficult moment, and every decision to choose the team over the individual. Protect the locker room, and the locker room will protect the season. Resilient minds, premier results. That's what we're building here with the Premier Mindset, and that's what we're talking about here in terms of that locker room and keeping it safe. And with that, recognition is the first step. If you don't realizing these things are happening, it's really hard to stop it. It's really hard to intervene. So be aware, take a look, and see what's going on. As always, this episode is meant to provide tools for performance, not to replace individualized therapy. If you're struggling with anxiety, burnout, or persistent stress, professional guidance is critical. At Premier Performance LLC, we work with high achievers to implement strategies like these with precision, accountability, and results. If you want to work on that together, reach out to us, let us know. Let's get something scheduled and see where it goes. I make it a point to give you actionable tools you can use to find success in your life. So let me know if it's helping. I love staying connected with you all. I want to know if these things are helpful or if there's different ways we can go about them that would feel more helpful for you. I also would love to hear how this episode specifically impacts you. If it's helpful, that's awesome. And I'd love to hear more about it. If it's not, that's okay. I want to hear why. If there's someone in your life you think may need to hear it or may get something from it, share it with them. Our goal is to spread this to as many people as possible to help improve people's life best we can. If it was helpful, leave a review and help us spread that reach. The more reviews, the better. And any questions you have, reach out. We also have the Premier Mindset newsletter, and that link is in the episode description. So make sure to follow along with that. That's new, and we're going to drop more content literally every week as that continues to come out. If you want to reach out with questions or concerns or anything we can do for you, you can email me at tmailer, my last name spelled Mahler, at premierperformancereno.com. You can text or call me directly at 775-561-0056. The Instagram and the TikTok both have the same name, which is premier_performance_Reno for both of those. The Facebook page or the LinkedIn page has the same name as well, which is Premier Performance LLC for those two. And then the Twitter or the X account is at Premier Reno LLC. And our website is www.premierperformancereno.com. So get involved in those communities as we continue to build them. Reach out if you have any questions, no matter how big or small it is. I'd love to hear from you guys. And next week, we're going to jump into another interview, this time with the Stable Arena, which is going to be pretty cool and pretty interesting and how they do their work there. So we're going to really dive into that so you guys can explore that and explore the different ideas that can come from that. As always, be the best you can be. Put yourself out there. Don't be afraid of success. Don't be afraid of failure. Push yourself and see what those limits are, and then be willing to go past them just a little bit. Have a great time. Enjoy your week. Have some fun in between. Challenge yourself, and I'll see you all next week. Bye.